Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video we're going to be doing a deep dive on Ruby Amethyst control for the Azurite Z metagame. I wanted to get to this for the first weekend in January, but I am feeling a little under the weather, but hopefully this video is still coherent enough for you. And the reason I'm doing this is because you guys provided some really good feedback on the Ruby Sapphire video that I did, so make sure you like, comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do so. I do see those statistics, and if you guys like this series, I'll continue to do more deep dives. I do test these decks out to find out what weaknesses and what certain matchups are good versus bad, and the strengths of these decks are. So there is a decent amount that goes into this. It's not just me, it's talking about theory altogether. But Ruby Amethyst in general, I think, is in a very awkward position. Yes, it won the European Championship, but the deck has more or less been unchanged for the past several sets. Basically, ever since we've got the introduction of Flynn Rider in set 4, this has kind of been a hallmark 2-drop of the deck. But what we're seeing is Amber Steel is quickly becoming the big threat of the format. We did adapt some new cards from Azurite Z, mainly the new Genie, and we've made some additional adaptations from previous sets in order to better deal with the metagame, such as the introduction of Bell Accomplished Mystic, kind of coming in as a staple in the deck now. The issue that we're finding though is because Amber Steel, Amethyst Steel, and even Emerald Steel are still around in the format, some of these steel damage cards really throw off your curve quite heavily, and when you're on the draw, you can fall behind quite significantly, and it's very hard to catch up to the point where you lose the game before you even have a chance to be prepared, which in this format now, because of Pete, games referee, you don't even have this as a fallback option in order to reset the board state and come back, right? So there's a lot to consider here, and I do think that this variation of Ruby Amethyst control will probably fade away if Amber Steel continues to dominate the format. It's still a strong deck, don't get me wrong, and just because certain interactions out the Flynn Rider Sisu combination doesn't mean that this is without merit. Your opponent has to have the answer in order to deal with it. But in my testing and what I've seen at top tables from reviewing matches is oftentimes this card gets inked quite heavily. There are certain scenarios and certain matchups where this card just absolutely puts in work. I remember viewing a Ruby Amethyst versus a Sapphire Amethyst matchup, and the Sapphire Amethyst I think missed the 2-drop, and the Ruby Amethyst player ended up putting out 2 Flynn Riders and then a Sisu, and they got to like 14 lore by like turn 4. It was something crazy. And yeah, like in those situations, the Flynn Rider is just an auto win, right? But in general, I would say Ruby Amethyst shouldn't need to rely on this card or this kind of combination in order to win games. You already have positive matchups into other control, I guess you can say mirrors, like into Ruby Sapphire, because you have such a passive draw engine, right? You play the Chernobog Followers, the Magic Brooms, the Genies, and the Rapids, as well as Friends on the other side, and then you have the strongest removal in the game in Ruby. So if you do face up against steel decks, you just try to play the early and mid game the best you can so that the opponent doesn't run away with the game, and then you likely just close the game out because you have the much stronger cards and you have way more resources, most likely, than your opponent. We all know how explosive steel can be, right? If they do get the lines into outing your board with the songs into a whole new world to refresh the card advantage, it's almost impossible for any deck to come back from that. But Ruby Amethyst traditionally has been one of the decks that could do that because of Be Prepared. But like I mentioned, due to them racing you, having a lot of lore pressure cards like the Daisy Duck, the Mr. Smee, even the Piglet, Lawrence, etc., and then having Pete to just lock out actions, this deck can really just fall behind. And again, if you've played those matchups, you know exactly what I mean. So, into other mid-range decks, into control decks, Ruby Amethyst is still probably the strongest option, but into the aggro decks, especially the steel ones, which again, you've seen the Canio's Amber Steel Mine. We'll pull that up very quickly here. I think it's probably number 1 on trending. But even the Canio's list here, you can see, like, yes, it's an aggro deck, but they're still playing the songs. And these songs are massively disruptive to your game plan, right? I've talked about this before, where if they do end up going Cindy 1, or even if they go Daisy 1 or Pappy 1 and then like any 2-drop, on turn 3 they could sing, or not sing, but just hard cast Strength, hard cast Storm, and throw you off your curve as well, right? And you need very specific lines of play in order to facilitate your game plan as a Ruby Amethyst player. If you don't get or if your 1-drop doesn't survive and you don't get your Madam Mim Snake online and you're relying on the Flynn Rider, which is a very susceptible body at 2/2, it gets Strength on turn 3 if your opponent plays a character on 1 and 2. It gets Storm Raged by a Cindy on turn 2 as well. You have no surviving 1-drop and you have no turn 2 play. and then your Fox on turn 3 is also dead if your only 3-drop is Sisu. So the Mim cards become liabilities in the early part of the game, and as you know, you let that Daisy Duck quest 2 or 3 times, by the time you're actually able to play something on turns 3, 4, your opponent might already be at like 6, threatening 10, 12 lore, right? And at that point, it's very hard to come back from the game. So with that in mind, I did want to talk about another list that I've had some moderate success with. And we're seeing this pop up a little bit in the meta. I was a fan of this card when I first saw it. I picked up non-foil and foil copies of it myself. And that was Madam Mim Tiny Adversary. And there's a couple of reasons why this card was intriguing to me. And this is before Amber Steel kind of came to the forefront of the meta as being a huge meta threat again. Even these aggro variants with the mine and introducing the songs like we just saw in the Canyo's list. It's a 2-cost inkable card, so good on that right away. It's a 0/3 body. The 3 willpower allows you again to survive if your opponent has to hard cast Storm on 3, if they play a 1-drop and a 2-drop, if they sing Storm, your Madam Mim Tiny Adversary will survive. What's even more important is if you opt to play a card like Diablo, which is a great mitigating factor for the Cindy Storm interaction, like if they want to Cindy Storm your Diablo, sure, you just wasted a resource or wasted tempo, not really wasted tempo, right? But they used up one of their power spells, right? Because they don't play too many, in outing a card that replaces itself. You prevent me from getting 1 lore, you still have your Cindy, the Storm Rage replaces itself, so it's still a decent interaction for you. You stop me from setting up a Mim Snake play, from bouncing back my Diablo, you again prevent me from getting the 1 lore on the quest, but I don't feel bad about losing this. Versus, I feel bad about losing my Chernobog followers. I feel bad about losing my Magic Broom. I don't get any advantage off of these cards. I lose my 1-drop, I lose the line of play to go into Mim Snake on 2, and I lose a lot of tempo. And you've also seen me introduce Minnie Mouse back into the 1-drop slot, which again seems very, very odd. But there was as of me recording this video, I think there was a 1K at SGC, or SCG, sorry, and Noimnot actually won with Ruby Amethyst, and he had 2 Olafs in his list. And I like Minnie Mouse because, you know, classy over the Olaf. But Olaf is the exact same, it's a 1/3. So it's interesting to see that Noimnot put back Olafs into his list as well. Because again, the interaction of this thing surviving a storm helps you facilitate your turn 2 Snake, your turn 3 Mim Fox play if needed, right? And Mim Fox continues to be one of the best turn 3s in the game. So for going, in this case, the Flynn Rider for more stability, sacrificing the aggressive lore gain, to me, is, how do I put this? It's a safer route of play, but you're making it harder for yourself to win into other control matchups, right? Because the Flynn Rider into other control matchups, into other slow decks is very good, right? Flynn Rider helps you run away with the game, but I would argue you don't even need to do that. So you can see I'm running 10 1-drops, not 8. I've cut the Chernobog followers down to 3. I've eliminated the Magic Broom, and you could argue you could play Magic Broom instead of Chernobog followers because the 1/2 body is also nice. But the main thing is Chernobog and or Magic Broom helps out the 0/1 characters, which are opposing Diablos and Cursed Merfolk. So either one, Chernobog followers or Magic Broom, does it. They both get outed by Storm. Yes, the 1 willpower makes it get pinged off by stuff, but I mean, what are people playing that's going to ping this off? Like Tinkerbell, by the time that comes down, you know, your Magic Broom's going to be susceptible to other removal anyways. Fire the Cannons, they both, you know, Chernobog and Magic Broom gets outed by, so those interactions are fine. For 2, I'm playing 10 2-drops as well. The Kuzco has been okay. It's not as impactful as the Diablo is on 1. So I think you could maybe cut this out for maybe 2 copies of the Queen of Hearts. I've seen that be teched at some of the top tables by some top Ruby Amethyst players on the online simulator that shall not be named. But it was tested. I didn't really see it put in that much work because I don't believe they were running it with the Tiny Adversary. But if ideally you did have Tiny Adversary or more than 1 Tiny Adversary up, and you did get the Queen of Hearts, Impulsive Ruler. I play this card so much, I don't know how I forgot the subtitle. But this card can become a 3/2 or a 4/2 with the Mim Tiny Adversary. If you have 5 ink and you can play this card and a crab in the same turn, this becomes a 5/2, right? You have a lot of interesting interactions if you are running these cards that benefit from getting strength boosts because you're running Tiny Adversary. And Ruby Amethyst is one of those decks that really naturally get that benefit. So if you're in a meta, like a localized meta, where you are fearing the aggro decks, because it seems to me like unless you're going to a really high level event, and don't get me wrong, Ruby Sapphire is still very much present at top tables. I think the top rated player right now is a Ruby Sapphire player, and they're on like 1800 elo or something. It's crazy. And they play the deck very, very well. Ruby Amethyst is still, like the traditional version, is still a very powerful deck and still a very powerful option. You don't get completely blown out by steel. You just potentially have a line of play that, you know, or the steel decks potentially have a line of play that suffocate your early game. Whereas a deck like this can help you survive the aggro meta a little bit more, right? Playing more resilient 1 and 2 drops. And then the crab, I've talked about this before, being in like a crab-esque meta, it just puts in so much work to the point where your Minnie Mouses, your Kuzcos if you're playing them, or Queen of Hearts, your Madam Mims, or an existing crab on board that can crash and boost up an Elsa that you, like, let's say you have a crab on board, and then you're on like 5 ink, you play the Elsa, you tap down something, use crab to crash, and then crab boost the Elsa to a 5/5, and then Elsa take it. Like, there's so many interactions with crab in this deck, right? Boosting up Genie to take out opposing Genies, etc. Making Goat, which is already overstated at 4/3, a 7/3. Like, crab helps facilitate so many different lines of play. It's really, really strong. To be fair, like, I was considering running the old Pinocchio, the one that exerts, but I never ended up getting around to testing it. I don't think it would be that good. I also wanted to try the 2-drop Tremaine that drains a lore, but I also think that won't be good simply for the fact that they're uninkable, and if I was playing the 2-drop Tremaine, I'd want to play the 6-drop Shift target. But this deck just seemed to work a little bit better. I did have success into Emerald Steel and Amber Steel on 2 separate matches. Actually, the Emerald Steel and the Amber Steel, one of the Amber Steels were both on Dwarf Mines, and then I played one Amber Steel song, and I beat them all in 3, right? So no 2-0s. I was on the draw for the Amber Steel Mine, ironically enough, out of 2 out of the 3 matches, and I was on the play for the other Amber Steel and for the Emerald Steel. So, you know, take those matchups as you will. I didn't end up playing any Ruby Sapphire, unfortunately, but I imagine that this deck should still do decently well into that as well. But getting back to some of the more important interactions, again, if you've watched the top tables or you've played any of these interactions, you know that Genie can actually be a bit of a detriment to you in those faster paced matchups. Like, putting down a Genie when your opponent has like 4 characters on board already that are going to quest for 8, like, this doesn't do anything, right? Like, this is a good progressive card, it's a good aggressive card, and for that reason I've cut this one back to 3 in this list instead of going to the 4. You still have interesting interactions and it's still your aggro quester, but you're playing a much more tempo oriented strategy here, and you still have benefits off of like Merlin Crab boosting Genie, Elsa with the Genie taking out opposing Genies, etc., or Belle moving damage counters. But honestly, opposing Genies into a Ruby Amethyst Mirror or into any other Amethyst deck, like, you have the strongest removal in the form of Brawl, in my opinion, for it anyways. It just directly deals with the Genie. Yes, the Genie replaced itself and you lose tempo from playing the Brawl, but you prevent your opponent from questing for 2. You outed their threat that they played the previous turn. Brawl costs 3, Genie costs 4, so it actually kind of evens out. And again, because you're on so many Amethyst cards, like, you don't really care about the lost air quotes card advantage from losing or going -1, I guess you could say, by playing Brawl, outing a Genie, but the Genie replaced itself. So it's an interesting list to consider. It just has a stronger push into some of the aggro decks, I find. We've cut the Mauis from 3 to 2 in this list as well. I talked about liking 3 Mauis, but the more that I've tested, the Maui's impact is not nearly as strong, I think, as in previous formats, because again, Maui's great to come down and trade and then trade again and get like a nice 2-for-1, but it doesn't really matter when your opponent's on 16 lore and you drop, or will be on 16 lore next turn, and Maui only deals with 1 interaction, right, or 1 point character that's questing for like 2 or something. You just need faster, higher impact cards, and this lower to the ground package, especially with the Crab being able to boost up and trade up cards like your Minnie Mouse, your Kuzco to replace itself, your Snake, etc., and then the Tiny Adversary being a card that can simply just survive, let alone boost up your characters with the Challenger ability, is pretty interesting. Aside from that, you know, 2 Mana Medusas and the 1 Sisu I think still has a place here. Yes, you're not playing the 3-drop Sisu because you're not playing Flynn. I've opted for Crab instead, and honestly, like, yes, I lose a 2 quester, but people are playing around Sisu, and you see this at top tables. People, and especially against aggro decks, right? Aggro decks will empty their hand. They basically have an empty hand by turn 4 anyways, right? They're playing docks to refill their hand, inking, playing out their card. So Sisu ends up being a 2-1, a 2-4, a 1-4. People are playing around the small Sisu now. And for that reason, I just found Crab to be way more reliable. Dropping this on 3, boosting up a character, getting a positive trait, having a singer on board for friends, just having a reliable 3-3 body, a card to bounce. It's the best of everything. It feels bad bouncing a Sisu, right? In traditional Ruby Amethyst, like you'd never want to bounce your small Sisu in Ruby Amethyst. So like bouncing Crab though, it feels fine. Like Crab can trade into something being a solid body and then be bounced back. So the deck just feels safer, if that makes sense, and less of a liability with some of the cards that you're playing. You know, to be fair, you top like a Flynn Rider late game, you top like a Madam Mim Tiny Adversary late game, when people already have established boards, you and your opponent, they're both going to feel underwhelming. But the Tiny Adversary could potentially put in work. Another interaction that I didn't really talk about, like Madam Mim boosting up the other Madam Mim Fox into a 5-3 doesn't really matter too much, but it can come up. But the main thing is it boosts up this Elsa as well to a 3-5 or a 4-5 if you have more than one, and that could actually be kind of relevant, right? We already know how important the X and 3 stat line is. So it just synergizes really well with the deck from my testing. The final thing I'll say before I wrap up here is another reason why this deck is also pretty resilient, and the reason why I beat the mine variants of decks that I went up against was these locations that come into play can be very problematic for you to deal with, and having cards that boost up your strength, like giving Challenger with the Mim and the Crab, is a huge benefit. Like I can't tell you how many times I took out like Hidden Coves, Mines, etc. Well, basically just those two, because of like Crab coming in, giving me the +3 on like a snake to instantly out a mine. Like that is such a positive trade for you. Like your opponent develops the mine, they're depending on this card to not really generate them lore, but to just sort of kind of control the board a little bit, and then you just instantly out it, and the mine only deals 2 back, which is another interesting consideration, right? So these X and 3 characters end up surviving the mine if a knight character moves into the mine, and that can be very beneficial for you as well, right? Like it's just a deck that if you want to counter the steal and locations and aggro, this variation just seems stronger. So that's going to do it for this deep dive, guys. Again, hopefully you enjoyed it. I know it's kind of boring just looking at a screen, but hopefully it did provide some insight. Let me know what you think if you made it this far in the video. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.